Morgan is a citizen of the Penobscot Indian Nation where he grew up. He received his BA in Native American Studies from Dartmouth College and his MFA in fiction from Stonecoast low-residency program here in Maine. His story collection, Night of Living Rez, which was published in 2022, won the New England Book Award for fiction and is set in a Native community in Maine, which I think we all know, and explores what it means to live, survive, and persevere after tragedy. The New York Times called it remarkable, an electric, captivating voice. Talty has assured himself a spot in the canon of great Native American literature. That was wonderful. Those are wonderful words. Talty's work has appeared in Granta, the Georgia Review, Shenandoah, TriQuarterly, Native Magazine, LitHub, and elsewhere. He's a winner of the 2021 Narrative Prize. His work has been supported by the Elizabeth George Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Talty teaches courses in both English and Native American Studies, and he is on faculty at Stonecoast MFA in creative writing. He's also a prose editor at the Massachusetts Review.
So in the past 2 minutes that I've been thinking about my presentation and putting it together, I don't know. I wanted to just open with a passage, just from the opening story from my book, Night of Living Rez, and use it as a means, I think, to kind of go to there, yeah, right. Because Tommy's book, I think, came out at a very important and sort of like timely time for Indigenous literature. And that's something I really want to talk about. I think the main question, though, that I'm really concerned with today, how has his book challenged the way that we read or view literature or texts, produced by Native people? How is it that we read them? How do we learn from them? What are we taking from them? What are we bringing to the page, right? So I'll start with Burn and moving into there and kind of maybe get an answer, I don't know, but I'll leave you probably with more questions than anything. So this is Burn, this is the opening story. Winter, and I walk the sidewalk at night along banks of hard snow. I come from Rab's apartment off the reservation. Rab, this white guy with a wide mouth and eyes that closed up when he last sold pot. He was all no bullshit too. I'd asked for a gram, and after I reached in my pants and jacket pockets, looking for the cash and the cigarette, all I do is read children's books to my 1-year-old. It's real bad. He was all no bullshit too. I'd asked for a gram, and after he weighed it and put it in a plastic baggie and held it out to me, I reached in my pants and jacket pockets, looking for the cash among the cigarette wrappers and pocket knife. And he didn't believe me as I acted the part and kept saying, shit, it must have fell out. He shook his head, took the weed out of the baggie and put it back into his mason jar. I ain't smoking you up, he said. So then I said, fuck you, Rab, I really did lose the money. You'll see. Watch when I come back here in 30 minutes with the money I dropped. You feel stupid then. He shrugged his sorry, man, and I slammed his door as I left. At the bridge to the reservation, the river was still frozen. Ice shined white-blue under a full moon. The sidewalk on the bridge hadn't been shoveled since the last nor'easter crashed snow in November, and I walked in the boot prints everyone made who walked the walk to Overtown to get pot or catch the bus to wherever it was us Skeetons had to go, which wasn't anywhere because everything we needed, except pot, was on the res. Well, except Best Buy or Bed Bath & Beyond, but those natives who bought 4K Ultra DVDs or fresh white doilies had cars, wouldn't be taking the bus like me and Fellas did each day to the methadone clinic. That was another thing the res didn't have, a methadone clinic. But we had sacred grounds where sweats and peyote ceremonies happened once a month, except since I had chosen to take methadone, I was ineligible to participate in native spiritual practice, according to the doc on the res. Natives damning natives. So I'm there. You wanted arrested and you ain't getting arrested. So again, I want to thank the Maine Humanities Council for inviting me, for inviting all of us, and for having Tommy's book there, be part of this huge conversation. think there's so much we could talk about, or I can talk about regarding this book, and I think kind of the history of Indigenous literature, fiction, nonfiction, poetry. I'm looking at my poor student who's in here, who's like, we're gonna go over this stuff again. This is what we're talking about right now. But it's interesting. What was it you said that the New York Times added that the book contributed to the great Native American literary canon or something?
Yes.
It's fascinating to see those sort of categories, right? It's like our books get shoved into these like slots, and so there's the Native American Renaissance. Are people familiar with that term or phrase? There's a guy, Kenneth Lincoln, coined it in the 1980s, and he was basically like, oh, there was a renaissance of Native American literature, right? That happened starting with N. Scott Momady's, may he rest in peace forever, Housemaid of Dawn, which won the Pulitzer Prize. I think it came out in 68 or 69. And Kenneth Lincoln, kind of, who was a non-native, who's a scholar, was like, okay, it begins here. This is the Renaissance period. And where does it end? I don't know. I have my own ideas, which I think I'll try to answer here. But if you look at early like New York Times reviews of Momaday, and then after, I think the next like big Indigenous piece that came out was James Welch's Winter in the Blood in the 70s. The New York Times critic for Momaday's book basically does not talk about it at all as being really like anything other than literature, anything other than, a native writer, writing a novel. And then you look at Welch's, and it's very much the same thing. The critic goes, there's nothing Indian about this novel. And I find it fascinating, right? The juxtaposition between then, when in the 60s, predominantly a large white readership was looking at these texts and being like, oh, okay, yeah, there's this book, a native wrote this book, literature, wrote this literature. But now it's like, oh, look, there's, some native books coming out, right? And you go into certain bookstores and you can even see it, it's like Native American fiction, Asian American literature, African American literature. And one of the assignments I have for my students at the end of the semester is they have to put together a course called Introduction to White People Literature. So it's like asking us to kind of change the way that we look, right? And change the way that we consider, what is the default form of storytelling. And there's so much here I can unpack. One, a Renaissance, for there to have been a Renaissance, there should have been, I don't know, the destruction of something early, right? So what was destroyed? I don't really know. So people and scholars have argued about that, like they've argued about the green light and the Great Gatsby, it's just green, I don't know. So it's strange to watch, 60 years of transformation happen. And, I think we're in an age where it's like we have to ask ourselves, like, what is Native literature, right? Like, what is it we're reading, right? And how are we reading it? I've always thought of it, I think, to borrow just from geography, I think they use the term, it's like the American imagination or something, right? All the stuff, if you opened your phones right now and you went to Google Images and you typed in Native American, you wouldn't see anybody who looked like me on the first, set of pages. You just wouldn't. It would be natives and regalia and Deb Holland, and that's it, So even Google Images, even Google, thinks of us as this thing that exists, but in only certain areas, right? We're like the popular and the convenient, right? That's how it's been presented, I think, over time. You think of that commercial with like the Italian actor who's like canoeing and like he sees garbage and like a tear rolls down his eye or something. And you guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah, if you haven't, go watch the commercial, it's funny. But, you know, I mean, I always want to show the video, but it curses too much. Oh, you're bringing me water. Okay, thank you, you read my mind. Thank you, Simone. It's a great Dave Chappelle skit on Native Americans. I don't know if anyone's ever seen it. You should watch it. I highly recommend it. It's just built on stereotype until the very end, and he just like hits you with the truth. Basically, he got so high with a bunch of indigenous folk, and he said the chief allowed him to stay with the people, and they gave him his own teepee to sleep in, and he said, which I thought was a little fucked up because they all had houses. And he's like, why can't I be inside watching TV with y'all? You know, instead I got to sleep in the grass, right? So, you know, he and I think a lot of other people understand this like weird idea of what an indigenous person is, right? Versus knowing what an indigenous person is, or having, you know, a sense that we exist, we're here, you know, we're not, as Google image would suggest, dressed in regalia and, you know, just, or being Deb Holland, you know. So I'm always curious, I'm like, how much of that has affected the way we read, right? Like when we go to a text. So we start with the 60s, and I hope I'm not boring people to death. And we go all the way up to, is it like he who shall not be named? Sherman Alexie, yeah. You know, who he came, I mean, he was writing in the 90s, right? And he kind of blew up, he became very popular. And how many people have read his work? Yeah, right, everybody's read his work. Let's see, how many people have read, my own knowledge of native lit is lacking, you know? How many people have read The Jailing of Cecilia Capture? Oh, okay. What else? How many people have read The Lesser Blessed? One person. I can go on. I think the point is, you know, besides, you know, Momaday, Welch, Erdrich, Joy Harjo, who? Oh, yeah, Louise Erdrich, Morgan Talty, no, all the way up through to the 2000s, 90s, 2000s, we run into Sherman Alexie. And Sherman Alexie bounced into mainstream literature by, I would just simply say, you know, by writing fiction that I think contributed to the way people write and talk about Native fiction, right? By saying like, oh, this is part of like the literary canon of Native fiction now, you know what I mean? As opposed to just saying that this is like a part of the canon of literature. You know, the great example is in Every Little Hurricane, for example, the main character, which is from his first book, The Lone Ranger and Tonto, Fist Fight in Heaven, which breaks so many rules as a writer. Like one story switches point of view like mid like paragraph, and I'm like, what? You know, and I don't know. But anyways, the narrator goes, Victor watched his father cry huge, gasping tears. Indian tears. What does that mean? Tell me, what does it mean? I'm a teacher and I tell you you have to write an essay about this story and you use that. What do you come up with? What do Indian tears represent? Obviously, this is lacking a lot of context, right? I've taken it from the story, but when an academic has done this over and over again, and has asked the students to do it, and they're always like, it represents, you know, the long tragic history of indigenous people. And you know, this, and all these comparisons between, you know, like slavery and like all of this different stuff, but none of it, and I'm not trying to tell you this is how we're supposed to read literature, but none of them talk about it in the context of the story. So here we have an example of Sherman Alexie preying on, triggering word, preying on the readership, right? A white readership who has perhaps carried for a long time these popular images of the dead native and, you know, all these things, and puts it into this tier, right? It's lazy writing. It just is. It's lazy writing. It's manipulative writing. It's not earned writing. And he remains so popular because one, I don't want to talk too much about him because like why we talk about Sherman Alexie when we're going to talk about the amazing Tommy Orange. But Sherman Alexie's running a workshop. I don't know if anyone's familiar or knows about that. He's running a workshop on how to tell your own cancellation story. I signed up and got in, so we'll see how that goes. But Alexie, though, in part, played a very big role, I think, maybe, I don't know. This is just my own thinking as a writer, in building a bridge between, I think, what was occurring in that Renaissance era, and I think which ends with Alexie somewhere. But now we're in a new era, I think, of indigenous writing, and I don't know what to call it. I don't. I think it doesn't start necessarily with there. I think what there does is forces us to think about the texts that were in our peripheral vision prior, you know, to there, but then also to the stuff that comes out after. I remember when I was reading this in 2018, I was working on this book, and I remember being like, God damn it. I was like, he did what I was trying to do, you know? But then I realized that wasn't the point. You know, so once there came around, and I guess he had to go down to New York and sign 12,000 copies of his book. I had to do 2,000 like a few weeks ago for my next book, and it took me like 6 hours. I was like, how did you do that? Why? And he was like, I don't know, I didn't like it. I don't blame you. But so we're gonna leave Sherman in the past. His work is there. We have to deal with it. We have to confront it, right? You know, the question that is posed and has been posed, right, is, you know, what do we do with the art of monstrous men, right? I think we also eventually have to come and ask the question, what do we do with the monster eventually, right? What do we do with those people who have committed, right, you know, acts? Like how and in what ways do we find forgiveness? Which I think is a large part of, you know, it's something I've always dedicated my writing to, right? Asking that question, how do we forgive the people who have hurt us the most? And is it possible, and can we? Instead of simply tossing them away, right? Or doing what society has with them. And I think there brings that idea out, right? It brings a lot of ideas out. The one connecting sort of factor that most people, I think, there are like, you know, talk about from an urban experience, right? Being like, oh, we finally get to see a book about natives who live in the city, right? You know, and like, it's fascinating. It really is. You know, we see, you know, he has these beautiful lines throughout his prose. I mean, it's fantastic, but like beautiful moments where he describes landscape, right? He describes the buildings, you know, all of that material as being nonetheless from the earth itself. So it's like, does it really matter? You know, like what is nature in a way? You know, this building is nature. I mean, these types of questions have been asked too, right? And strangely thinking of Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, right from like hundreds of years ago, you know, writing about, you know, how dirty Paris was and how he found the beauty in this decrepitness. And Tommy's not necessarily doing that, but he's writing about a cast of native characters who come from all of these different places geographically, right? And everybody's read the book, right? Okay, so there's no spoilers here, yeah. But the one thing I find that most people don't, or at least I haven't seen really, is this idea of internalized colonization that has happened within indigenous Indian country. Because how does the book end? How does Tommy's book, how does there end? Yeah, it's a gun, it's big. Yeah, there's this neat, everybody gathers at this powwow, right? And in Oakland, and the robbery goes bad, and who is in that building? There's most indigenous people, right? Right? It's full of indigenous people, and it's violence, natives against natives, right? And so I think about that line in that story, Burn. When I read this book and I finished it, and Burn had already been part of it, it had been written and I'd said natives damning natives. And I'm like, God damn it, he had the theme, But I was like, this is good. Like this is I think something we need to talk about. Not just in native communities, but in communities everywhere, right? In what ways are we continuing to further enact violence, right, whether physical or mental, against the people who we consider family, right, as well as the people we consider to be, the other, so to speak, right? How do we, how are we treating people? And that, in and of itself, can be reflected in the way we read, because when we're reading literature, we're reading about people. It doesn't matter that it's fiction, right? We're reading about character. I mean, some books are bad and they don't have great characterization, but the ones that do, we're seeing real people. I believe it was Ocean Young, the poet. I'm not sure if people are familiar with his. Yeah, okay, everyone's familiar with him. He had a New Yorker piece published where he said, he's like, I feel most alive when I'm reading, right? Because for him, it's, that human experience, that, that condition, that books or texts are supposedly supposed to deal with, that invigorate him, that bring him to life. And so if we start asking that question, right, like, how are we treating ourselves? How are we treating others? Perhaps it might switch a little bit into the areas into the space I'm talking about of like, how do we read native fiction? Like, what are we looking for? Like, when you buy a book by, I don't know, like a white author, for example, like, why are you buying that book? Why are you buying a book by a native author, right? Is there a difference? You're like, I took a native lit class as an undergrad at Dartmouth, and the professor had us ask why we were in the class, and this is Ivy League stuff, guys, Ivy League stuff. This one kid goes, well, I was like really interested in arrowheads, so I thought it'd be cool to take this class. And I was like, what? And so we have not just 10, but a lot of people, I believe, who associate, indigeneity with sort of objects or commodities, right? I mean, literally look at the United States cabinet, for example. If you go to the website in the cabinet, right? It's called the cabinet. Let's look up the definition of a cabinet. Is usually a place where goods and foods are stored, right? If you look in there, everything seems, there's no people in there except the Bureau of Internal, the BIA, or there's some agency in there, right? Forgetting what it's called. Is it the Bureau of Indian Affairs? That's House. Yeah. And that includes people. That includes indigenous people, not just lands, not just resources, but people. So we have been for a very long time a commodity, something that's been meant to be either eaten or enjoyed, passed around, right? And I think that has translated to the way that we read books by indigenous authors. Here's a quote I wanted to read. I'm like, why? Morgan Talty, why do you not mark your pages? That one student in my class is like, this is how it goes every day, guys. wrote it down. Where's my system? I need it. I didn't put the page, I'm a jerk. Why did I do that? Well, anyway, that's when Opal is on Alcatraz, right? With her mom and her sister. And she says something along the lines of, I scribbled it here, let's see if I can read it. And this is on this, oh, I think it is page 57, actually. I knew it was somewhere around there. It's very early on in the book, folks. Yeah, 57, I found it. She says, this is when, stuff starts to go bad on Alcatraz, right? Where there's drinking and there's violence and all sorts of stuff. And Opal, says, I was unsure of whose side she was on, talking about her mother. So it was like, but I no longer trusted her mom. I was unsure of whose side she was on, or if there were even sides anymore, right? So very early on in this book, Tommy opens up, I think, this idea of Indian country being fractured, right? And not just Indian country, but the very the very reservations, whether, they're actual reservations or they're urban cities filled with Native people, right? I know, I keep looking back there, Bree, for some reason. Anyone else who's from the Penobscot Nation or anybody else who has grown up on the res, knows how much bickering and fighting happens, right? From a political standpoint, but also from like an interpersonal standpoint. And Tommy's book opened, I think, that view, or at least that's the view that I've always taken away from the book, is that we as Indigenous folks are hurting ourselves, right? And I'm not saying we're doing it deliberately, right? I'm not saying it's a conscious thing that we're doing, but it stems nonetheless from colonialism, right? It stems from the fact that we've been forced to use tools that were never our tools, right? To build, to build our own constitutions, for example, which we never have one. There's that one guy, I can't remember his name, he's always like, no, he shows up and everybody's like, okay. Some tribes have constitutions, others don't. We've been forced to kind of like replicate judicial systems. We have been forced to be like the West. No fucking wonder everybody gets shot at the end of this book, right? That's where we are, I think, today with Native fiction. I'm not saying it's solely about violence, but we've moved away from this. We've moved away from dominantly talking about, I think, like the cowboy Indian narrative type stuff, right? And I just can't wrap my mind around Louise Urchick, because she just says kind of like, fuck y'all scenes, I'm gonna go over here and just do my own. She has her own thing going on, but like nonetheless, her work still comes into play, right? Like the Roundhouse, for example, is a great example of work that speaks directly to issues Indian country faces, and isn't performative in the way that Alexi's was, wasn't performative for a white readership. It was just, this is the story and this is all you're getting. There's a band of Cherokee in North Carolina, I believe, that every year, I don't know if they still do it, but every year they would hold a fundraiser, and they would hold a fundraiser and they would invite all these white folks. It's white offensive, I don't know. non-Indigenous people to come over and to see like a play. And in the play, these Cherokees, they dressed up like West, the regalia they wore was regalia that the West would wear, that you typically would see, the very, like the Dene, most popular, like Dene type regalia. And, Cherokees, they just have like one little feather probably, like that, like that's it, but in order for those people to attend and to pay and to come in, they had to perform not themselves, but a completely different tribe, right? They had to adopt, the mentality or understand that in order to sell ourselves as a commodity, right, we have to kind of dress up like the popular, convenient indie that we've seen over and over and over again. Thank you, Disney. And one of the concerns is it's like, what about like the children who were there, right? Like thinking about Indigenous children, and they grow up seeing, their parents or their cousin or someone, dressed in this type of way. Like how, like I've always wondered, like they talk with the kids about like that this isn't what, like that this isn't us. Like they sit them down like, all right, we're gonna trick these people to get some money. Like I don't know, but to perform indigeneity or the performance of indigeneity, which on one hand we've had to do, I think, to survive, to get by, right? Like I feel like Native people feel like we've had to do that to a degree, to make money. I'm not blaming them, I'm not pointing fingers at nobody, right? But we need to stop, or I suppose non-natives need to stop thinking that that's the only aspect that we can bring, right? That I think plays a huge role as well into, what it means not to be native, but what it means to be human, right? Because despite wherever we come from, despite our backgrounds, despite our experiences, despite all of that stuff, the one thing that we all have in common is that we can feel, right? Is that we can feel pain, we can feel, happiness, joy. And if we're telling stories that are built on that, right? Like Tommy's, for example, and like a lot of Indigenous literature, true story, not true story, but stories that are really grounded in emotion, I think only then we're going to be able to move forward. And that's what Tommy's done. There's been a huge burst in Indigenous literature being, published, right? Brendan, so here we got his novel, right? Yeah, so yeah, it's great. We have now I'm drawing, I can't even think today, guys. Amanda Peters's The Berry Pickers, right? Which came out from Catapult, like an indie, although Penguin I think is also kind of like gonna eat them soon as an imprint, but blew up. It became this very popular book. It won the Andrew Carnegie Medal for excellence. Grossly my book, right? That's done well against all odds of story collections. There's TV, right? Now we have Native people are on TV, right? I don't know, it feels weird to say that, but like prior it was what? Smoke signals and those like old westerns, right? With like Indigenous people.
Oh, highway.
Yeah. And then you ever seen, and then you go back and you look at what they're actually saying in their native language, and they're like talking about like how small the director's what's is are and stuff like that, like when they translated the dialogue and everything, because they didn't get dialogue, they didn't care. But how do we challenge that then, right? And I think I feel like I've said it, but I think to sum up, I don't want to because we want to do the Q&As or Q&A happening, or no? No, am I just talking straight till 2? Oh, okay, cool. All right, everyone thinks shit. So the question, does there challenge how we read or view Native literature? And I guess I can expand that to texts, right? Not just books, but media, right? Music, all of that. How do we experience it? Do we come at it with this, exoticized foreknowledge of being like, with the Indian tears sort of idea, right? I'm reading this in this way because this is what I know of these people, this is what I know of their history. Or is it asking us to look at these characters as people? What do you think? I don't know. You don't have to tell me. Because I do in class all the time, like, you don't have to say anything, you can just sit there. This book forces us to see a cast of, how many characters? Yeah, that's a huge task. You ask any traditional, I said that to Rick Bass, who is one of the best short story writers of the 21st century, and he just whistled, because he comes from a long line of like, as he's a traditionalist in the sense of like the short story, and one character is hard enough to write about, let alone, this many. This is a book that brings all of these different characters, right? And we can imagine, right, all around. And the term is, this multiple perspective novel. In a literary term, it's parallax, which has been stolen from astrology, which means to look at an object from different points of view. Because we can't really objectively see everything, right? If this was all in first person, right? So, for example, if I had this look like that, like I can tell you what this looks like, but I can't see what's here. You would have to tell me. And so the heart of Tommy's book is this idea of, how do we reconcile Indigenous communities, but how do we reconcile communities in general, I think. And it's placed in the very center. And to get there, it's not one character, but it's a cacophony of voices all the way through. And that's what makes it so special, is because I can't think of a book that has that many voices in it. I just can't. Like, there's a lot of voices to handle and to balance. And so we get, in the end, not a sense of subjectivity around this idea, right? But a sense of objectivity, right? Anthropology. God, I don't know more people with this like academic talk, crap shit. I apologize. But anthropology, uses the term intersubjectivity, right? Scientists are always like, well, how can you be objective, right? If you are, just one person going out and studying, a community, a society. And they're like, well, we gather all this information and stories from people and we put it together. And, they coined the term intersubjectivity, meaning like, oh, now it becomes objective, or as close to objective as possible because we have everybody there. And that's what Tommy's book does. They're there, right? And I know they're there as this, takes it from Gertrude Stein, but really comes from a song he liked. But he had the quote, he was able to pull it out and be like, yeah, this is why I called it They're There, talking about it being the place. She had returned home and found that it was basically not what she had expected, right? Legitimate, but it had changed. And They're There, I like to think of as a direction, right? They're there, kind of like pointing, and not really, in my own way of reading, just looking at it, just looking at the language by itself, they're there. Right? Yeah, there's no comma in it. I would see people put commas in between it, and I'm like, no, because they're there, and be like a pat on the back, they're there, but huge difference, right? But they're there, like pointing into a space that hasn't really been talked about, right? And it's what I've been saying, this internalized sense of violence, right? This way that we have adopted and continue to adopt the attitudes of the West. All of us, not just Indigenous people, right? We continue to do this over and over and over and over again. So the point is, don't try to rob the powwow. If you've read my book, don't rob the tribal museum or group club so you can sell them on Antiques Roadshow. Don't do that. We need to find kindness, right? We need to find a sense of, I hate using this term, peaceful coexistence, right? We're not harming one another, but there points us into some direction, and that direction is never specified. It could be the past, it could be in the future. it doesn't really matter, I think, but the book is asking us to take a look at these characters' lives, right? Set in an entirely different situation, right? You know, we're looking at the opposite side of a coin here. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but and it asks us, all these characters ask us, right? Like, you know, how did we get here? Where are we going? What will happen? Because how does the book end? Ultimately, like, what are we left with?
Emergency room.
Yeah, we end, you know, in a hospital. It's a great place to end, right?
Mhm.
And what's wonderful about this novel is it kind of subverts the expectation of the novel, right? The novel is supposed to have this nice, like, I don't know, final 10 pages where everything is like kind of like settled, you know, and there's nothing there. But this ends with us not knowing whether or not this little boy dies, right? Now the question is, should he have written Wandering Stars, and answers that question? I don't know, and like go next. But now he has dropped Wandering Stars on us, which how many people read? Just started, okay, yeah. You have not bought it, you need to buy it. But if there's one left, don't touch it because I need it. But this book, I have to have a sit down with Tommy. Just to tell him that he needs to, I feel like there's one more. I feel like there's one more of this. When you read Wandering Stars, you will see it, I think. But I feel like there's one more book that belongs to these. What is it? They call it a sequel or a prequel. I don't know what you want to call it.
Trilogy.
Yeah, I feel like there's supposed to be a trilogy, like there really is. So I really think so. So I've been meaning to tell him that. If you guys see him, be like, did you hear what Morgan was telling you? You know about you know this being a trilogy. But Tommy has given us, I think, or maybe it's time that time gave to us, right? You know, his book came out in 2018, right when Alexei was outed as a predator. And I don't know, I heard rumors of everybody trying to make him the next Sherman Alexei. I don't know how true this is. I have to ask him. You know, I'm kind of afraid to ask him, but like about people trying to make him be the next Sherman Alexei in a way, kind of monopolizing. Because I don't know how many other Indigenous writers feel, but like I'd be eager to hear when we do a panel. Maybe that might be a question that comes up. But like he had dominated the market so heavily, and apparently I don't know. I heard. It's just like Indigenous gossip, I suppose, but like that he was asked to, or not asked, but kind of like seemed to be being pushed in that direction to be the next Alexei, to kind of take over that territory. And he was like, I feel like in his mind, he was like, no, F off. You know, I mean, Tommy is genuinely a great person who gifted us a book that came at a time that I think Indigenous people needed it, but everybody needed it. It's a book that's going to be celebrated, I think, continuously, even if Tommy says stop celebrating it, which I feel like he would say something like that. But they're there. I suppose I see you standing in the back, so I've run 3 minutes over. I guess the question I'll leave or end with is this, you know, where do you want to go with everybody else? Right? Do you want to go in this direction, or do we want to go back in time? Like, what is it? What are we meant to do now in this new era of Indigenous literature? Do we treat it like, oh, I got another book that I can, this actually looks like it was bitten, so that kind of works well with my metaphor. Do we consume the Indigenous, any type of indigeneity out there, or do we recognize it as being literature, as us being people, producing stories and telling stories that we've done forever, just in a different format, right? So the moral of my talk is, in the words of George W. Bush Jr., is our children's learning? I think it's how he said it in one of his speeches. I don't know, but let's rethink the way we approach texts. Let's rethink the ways we approach work by people outside of our experience, but with the understanding that we're connected nonetheless by feeling. And to quote Audre Lorde, we have to celebrate those differences, right? We have to celebrate them, because if we don't, we're going to continue to have powwows that end in gunfights. Thank you. Apparently, the last two, I just had to end with this because I feel like it'll be a crime if I don't do it, but the last two talks, there was, they talked about pot and mushrooms. Yeah, there was, Bree, you might be able to remind me of this, but there was a tribe from South America that came up and do you remember? A long time ago. And we hosted them on the reservation. They paddled all the way up. Yeah, they paddled all the way up, right? They were from South America. They came right way up. And they came and stayed, and I didn't smoke any of this shit, but it was salvia, the salvia wave of which was legal at the time. I think it might still be, but they brought this. I was in the woods with my cohort, and they were smoking this salvia or whatever, which only hits and lasts for a couple minutes. I don't know. But right when the first person took theirs, this tribe had brought this instrument, this really beautiful whoa, I don't know what it was, but it hit, and this kid was it was the heavens speaking to him. And so that's my story of a drug thing, which was about being and hallucinating and seeing stuff that I needed to share and was asked to. By nobody in particular over there. Thank you very much. Buy all the books. Thank you very much.